200 200.
Are you ready?
Yeah.
This is the Ross Kaminsky Show.
You're a great American.
He's a great guy.
Now, Ross Kaminsky on Denver's talk station, 630 KHAL.
No more lockdown, no more government overreach, no more fascist bullies disturbing our peace, no more taking of our freedom and our God-given rights, pretending it's for our safety when it's really to enslave.
Wow. That's some intense stuff by Van Morrison. I actually think it's his third anti-lockdown kind of song. This one is definitely not subtle. No more lockdown. No more fascist police. No more, telling us it's for our safety when the goal is to enslave. Intense.
No more Imperial College. Scientists making up crooked facts. No more lockdown. No more pulling the wool over our eyes.
Wow. I don't know. Well, I do know why. I was going to say I don't know why. I do know why. You just don't expect that kind of thing out of some fairly famous, and I do think you gotta call Van Morrison fairly famous. You don't expect that kind of thing out of a fairly famous member of entertainment media because we're so used to so many of them being liberals. Outspoken, sort of Karen kind of liberals. And I apologize to my good friend Karen, who is definitely not what people are calling a Karen these days. But, wow. All right, we got a lot to do today, and we've got some unbelievable guests. What an assortment of guests we've got. Coming up, actually, just in the next segment of the show, we've got Dr. Alveda King, Martin Luther King Jr.'s niece. And, I don't talk a lot about abortion on this show, but Alveda King is involved in, she's a pastor, among other things, and she's involved with a group called the Equality Petition and an Equality Proclamation, talking about something that kind of shocked me. I don't know what the context was where it came up the other day. I'm sure you'll remember. But I heard someone say that in New York City, more black babies were aborted than born, like every year. That's a stunning statistic. Like, regardless of your position on abortion, it's an unbelievable statistic. And we're going to talk with Dr. Alveda King about that, and as well about her view as to whether African Americans will move to support Trump in any significant way. Ramesh Ponnuru at 705, senior editor at National Review. He's one of the National Review guys who wrote an article lately where they had a bunch of their staff write different perspectives on whether to vote for Trump, whether not to vote for Trump. Ramesh Ponnuru is going to make an argument, I think, for voting for neither guy, neither Trump nor Biden. I think that's what he's going to say. And frankly, I wanted to have him on the show just partly because that's how I'm leaning right now. But I haven't really talked about it on the air much, and I thought it would be interesting to talk with him. And then something very, very different at 9:05, Amity Shlaes, just a great writer of history, wrote a new book called Great Society, which I finished a few days ago, and a history of the Great Society. And so much of it, it's not ancient American history, right? I mean, you're talking about a lot of stuff from the 1960s, 1970s, but so much of it still applies now in the way people are thinking about economics and politics, and I'm really, really looking forward to it. So I want to mention a couple of Supreme Court decisions from yesterday that I think they were wrongly decided. I'm not surprised they were. But I also think these things could lead to enormous problems after the election. I want to talk about that for a minute. So the Supreme Court heard a new challenge to the same Pennsylvania rule where they had previously, on the basis of a 4-4 tie, not been able to, or not put in a stay on the Pennsylvania Supreme Court's ruling that will allow ballots to be counted if they are received by Friday of election week, as long as they were mailed by election day, except that if a ballot arrives with no postmark or a postmark that cannot be read, under the rule, Pennsylvania will assume it was mailed on time and count the vote. And that latter part is a recipe for shenanigans. By the way, I'm not predicting with any of this that there's going to be some kind of massive numbers of tens of thousands of votes of, voter fraud. But you look at some of these states that allowed President Trump to win last time with his very narrow victories, and you wouldn't need much voter fraud, perhaps. We don't know if these states are going to be close this time or not. We don't know if any election in the United States this time is going to be within the margin of fraud or within the margin that a court will end up deciding it, and I sure hope it isn't. Whatever happens in this election, I do not want something close to half of the American people thinking that it was either decided by fraud or that a court decided an election. So anyway, the Supreme Court yesterday again allowed the Pennsylvania rule to stand, and then they issued another ruling, this one regarding North Carolina, and this is pretty crazy. North Carolina is going to allow receipt of ballots up to 9 days after Election Day. 9 days. Now, I do believe in North Carolina the ballot is going to have a postmark by Election Day, but still 9 freaking days. Now, North Carolina does say they expect to have most of their ballots, the vast majority of their ballots, in and counted on election night. North Carolina is probably not a state that is very risky for us not to know the answer there for a long time. Not impossible, but Pennsylvania is much more likely. Now, the Supreme Court didn't really say that what Pennsylvania is doing is okay. Basically, what they said was, we are not going to be able to dig into all of these legal issues and handle this case properly by Election Day, and so we're going to leave it as it is for now. Now, it wasn't unanimous, right? It was, I think it was 5-3. Justice Amy Coney Barrett, obviously the newest member of the Supreme Court, did not participate in either case. This was not because she was recusing herself because they were election-related cases, as Democrats had pushed her to do during her confirmation hearings, but rather it was that she believed that in order to get up to speed and fully review the briefs and get up to speed on all the legal issues would simply take too long, given that we are now 5 days away from the election, or yesterday, 6 days away from the election. And so she recused herself from those cases for that reason, because of the need for a prompt resolution, according to her spokeswoman. So I think this is really kind of scary. Justice Alito said, I reluctantly conclude that there's simply not enough time at this late date to decide the question before the election. But that doesn't mean that they won't make a different decision later. And so Pennsylvania has said that what they are going to do is they are going to keep separate all the ballots that are received within their extended ballot receiving window, right? The ballots that are received from whatever the cutoff time is on Election Day, which is what the actual law is in Pennsylvania, to the Friday, which is the new deadline as created by a court. So they said they're going to separate those. Now, can you imagine what would happen in this country if Pennsylvania counts all of the ballots under their new rule, and then the Supreme Court says that new rule by which a court rather than the legislature changed your election deadline, that new rule is illegal and unconstitutional, and you are not allowed to count ballots that were received after the deadline that your legislature has set into law. And imagine then if perhaps the state is so close that when you remove those ballots, maybe it switches the result in that state to the other candidate from the one that had been reported. And you could make an argument for this potentially to go either way. And once again, I'm not saying this is the highest probability thing, but what I am saying is that it's more than a zero possibility for that scenario to play out. And that will suddenly put the Supreme Court in the last position that they would ever want to be in, which is to say Bush v. Gore on steroids. And I think it's a scary thing. I do not like it at all. Justice Alito says that the Supreme Court needlessly created conditions that could lead to serious post-election problems. Quoting him, the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania has issued a decree that squarely alters an important statutory provision enacted by the Pennsylvania legislature pursuant to its authority under the Constitution of the United States to make rules governing the conduct of elections for federal office. He added, it would be highly desirable to issue a ruling on the constitutionality of the state Supreme Court's decision before the election. That question has national importance, and there is a strong likelihood that the state Supreme Court decision violates the federal Constitution. The provisions of the federal Constitution conferring on state legislatures, not state courts, the authority to make rules governing federal elections would be meaningless. Again, still quoting Alito here. If a state court could override the rules adopted by the legislature simply by claiming that a state constitutional provision gave the courts the authority to make whatever rules it thought appropriate for the conduct of a fair election. I also want to make one important point here. At least I hope it's important. My issue with all this is not some kind of partisan thing, thinking that having a longer election deadline is better for one candidate or another. It's not my point at all. I do know that a lot of Republicans believe that extending the deadline will benefit Democrats because they believe that a bigger percentage of Democrats will vote by mail, and then if they don't quite vote on time and the votes arrive late, then Republicans don't want those votes to be counted. I get that. But it's not my argument here. My argument here is a much more simple one, and one that I've made over and over again on issue after issue after issue. And that is, we have gotten to a place in this country where we have relieved legislatures of responsibility. And sometimes the legislators are willingly relieved of that responsibility. They don't want it. Sometimes you've got members of Congress or state legislators who want to pass a bill that says, let's all have clean air. Let's all have good elections. And then they'll say, we're going to leave it to somebody else to make all the rules. That's not how this is supposed to work. And it's especially wrong. I mean, it's one thing to say, all right, we're going to leave this to some, clean air expert in the Department of Health and Environment here in Colorado, or some federal agency. It's another thing entirely, though, I guess it's still on the same spectrum, but worse, to leave it to a judge. It's true that a bureaucrat is not elected. But bureaucrats at least can, with some difficulty, be fired, or at least a bureaucrat can be told, okay, this is the policy of the new government, and you're going to enforce this. And there's at least a little bit of influence there. Nobody's going to influence a federal judge. They've got their jobs for life. Even the founders wrote about this in the Federalist Papers. They said, look, it just doesn't make sense to think that federal judges will remain, let's say, feeling in debt to senators who approved them or a president who nominated them. Because you can't touch them. You can't do any, unless they commit some kind of, really unbelievably unethical or criminal act, and you could impeach them, which almost never happens. And you can't have someone like that changing the law. The laws have to be changed by our elected representatives. And the Supreme Court is making, I think, an enormous mistake here. Absolutely enormous. Brett Kavanaugh wrote a great concurrence a couple of days ago, the first time the Pennsylvania thing came up, and the left is just attacking him like crazy over it. Rich Lowry, who you know probably from National Review, but he wrote a piece about this for Politico. And it's remarkable. He shows all of these liberal media outlets talking about Brett Kavanaugh as some kind of threat to America because Kavanaugh is saying that courts shouldn't be able to just change the rules when they feel like it. I think this is really dangerous. And I have no idea whether the election overall is going to be close or a blowout, or whether any given state is going to be close or a blowout. And polls are all over the place. You got polls now showing Texas as a toss-up. I don't believe that it is, but I could be wrong. You got polls now showing Joe Biden at least tied and maybe slightly ahead in Georgia. I doubt that Biden wins Georgia, but I wouldn't bet my life on it, and so on. You've got you had a poll 2 days ago showing Joe Biden ahead by 17 points in Wisconsin. That, my friends, is impossible. And then you had a poll yesterday, and they're both good quality polls, in air quotes. Then you had one yesterday showing him up by 5 in Wisconsin. Well, he was up, Trump was down by 5 in Wisconsin in 2016. So we know what that means. Anyway, I am really worried for our country, and the Supreme Court is not helping.
This is Denver's Talk Station with Ross Kaminsky now. Tom Martino at 10, 630 KHOW, Denver.